normally do the session for today. But if at any point folks have questions or thoughts or ideas and you want me to stop and answer those, just put those in the chat. So we're here back to start a new series for the month of March. So last month we started with 2 different workshops, building a data culture and strengthening data literacy. What we decided to do is hold on to those sort of main themes and then talk through different elements of how you do those things based on feedback that we got in the evaluation survey. So that's why that survey is so important, and I look forward to hearing feedback on this session and on other videos if you watch them. So today the focus is on documentation, and documentation is it's sort of a big umbrella term for lots of different kinds of things that you can use, documents you can create to track the work that you do. Um, in some ways, documentation is some of the most invisible work, making documentation. But when you have great documentation, you're able to improve the processes. Teach new people about processes, keep track of where things are. It's a really great way to stay organized, and it's a really great way to unpack and make sure everyone has a deep understanding of how facts and insights come into being. So documentation is a really integral part of data governance and good data use. So the goals today are to talk about why we need documentation, some types of documentation, the anatomy of a documentation document, which may vary depending on what you're actually trying to capture, and then how to get started. And the sort of spoiler is that this is all going to be a work in progress. It's pretty uncommon for any one documentation process of a process or an analysis to be fully 100% complete. There's always ways that it can be improved or streamlined, solidified. So just know that continuous quality improvement is a big piece of doing this work well, and that applies to all elements of the work, including creating your documentation. Um, and a few caveats before we start. And it's nice that we have some new folks today so that the caveats won't seem like repetition to others. We use a lot of terms interchangeably, and so if people are confused about how we're using them, please, stop and ask questions. Building a data culture takes time, so we aren't going to solve everyone's challenges today. And the work is not meant to be done by one person alone. It's meant to be done in a team or in a group or in conversation with leadership. And our data and policy analytics unit is your partner in this work. So just know that if you're ever stuck, Carrie, as the agency data officer, you have a group of folks across state government that you can connect with. And the goal really is to continue to grow this network of data people across state government that folks inside an agency or outside an agency can continue to work with. And just a little bit about our unit. So we're part of the Office of Policy and Management. Most people are familiar with the budget team in the Office of Policy and Management. We are a different team, and we do a number of things. We maintain the state's open data portal, which is where many agencies share data, and they share data that's usually aggregated, so it doesn't have personally identifiable information, but the data are about major processes or agency business that are frequently requested. So we encourage folks to use the open data portal to share information that's sort of widely used by the agency. We manage the state's longitudinal data system and the data sharing that happens. That arrangement is called P20WIN, Preschool through Age 20 Workforce Information Network. And that arrangement allows about a quarter of our state's agencies to be in legal agreements with one another around data sharing. The ECD isn't one of those agencies, but that's not to say that it couldn't be. This started as a health and human services endeavor, so there were a lot of education-focused agencies who were originally part of that data sharing agreement. But our chief data officer, Scott Gall, is always looking to expand that table. So that's something of interest to your agency. You can always let us know. We now have the geographic information officer and associated assets under the heading of data and policy analytics. We support analytical capacity to agencies. So if folks need an extra help scrubbing in, looking at data that you have, trying to make sense of it, that's something that we're able to do. And we just provide the best practices and governance around data use. So we get lots of questions about the best way to do something or the federal way to do something. And so it's our job to really be on the sort of front line, thinking through how we can do this work the best way possible, how we can do it well. So that's a little bit about us and our unit. Augusta and I are part of the newly formed evaluation and impact unit. So just a quick note about us. I don't have a slide, but I'll just let you know that our unit was founded with support from the American Rescue Plan Act, and we are supporting agencies primarily who have American Rescue Plan funding, but that our work is not limited to supporting their projects. So good data informed practice is good for state business, just like it's good for American Rescue Plan funded projects. So this data capacity building is intended to really bolster agency resources and agency capacity. So let's talk documentation. Um, right now, you may have already been using some kind of documentation, related to something that you do. The thing that I like to think about that's pretty obvious is, recipes when you're cooking something at nighttime, or at the daytime. Who knows when you're cooking? Um, Recipes are a process. They tell you what ingredients you need, what steps you should take. Oftentimes, if it's something shared on the internet, there's comments that's like continuous feedback on, oh, this worked for me, with this ingredient, or I substituted this other ingredient. So documentation comes in lots of different forms. And we want to start by kind of highlighting the many ways that you may see documentation in your work, because I view the documentation as leaving yourself a trail of breadcrumbs back to where you started. So you may already have any one of the number of the items that you see listed here. You might have a map of a process or a map of a place. You might have a checklist of the steps that you followed, a frequently asked questions document, maybe a workflow, or even just a memo, something that you've written down, a document that says, first we did this, then we did this. Documentation appears in lots of different forms. So there's no one specific thing that we're going to break down and cover today. But each of these forms of documentation allow someone in a process using data to say, what do we do with these? What do we do when we had the information? What happened next? What were some of the things that we struggled with? What were some of the challenges that we faced? And what will we do differently next time? Um, you're already using documentation maybe in your everyday life. So I wanted to pick a really basic example of documentation. Like I said, a recipe is a good one. This is Lego's build of the month. So you might be interested in making this very cute penguin. This documentation has in it some components of what good data documentation have. So it shows you the finished product, what you're looking to get to, all of the kinds of components and ingredients that you might need, so the different elements, and step-by-step instructions, including maybe some details when things get a little bit complicated or a little too fine-grained. So documentation can be as simple as a set of instructions that you follow to get to a particular outcome. Now, in our building a data culture initial discussion, I talked a little bit about how, in order to be a data person, you kind of have to see all the data around you all the time, and we're using data all the time. So I wanted to kind of highlight ways that we're already using documentation so folks could really sit back and say, oh, documentation, that's not meant to be a scary word. It's not meant to sound formal. It's sort of like how we leave ourselves some kind of trail back to where we began. So these are examples of documentation that we might use in our regular work. On the left-hand panel, you'll see what we call metadata. So metadata is information, data on the data, basically. This is a screenshot of a recent data set that we launched on the Open Data portal. And the metadata gives you background on where the data came from and the motivation for its publishing. So the type is kind of tiny. I happen to be familiar with this data set because we just published it last week, but it provides agencies with status updates about their American Rescue Plan funded projects. And the data, some of the data in that data set come from a report that's actually sanctioned by a public act. And we list the public act language in case people are curious about. We actually have to list the language because it's in that particular program. It's hard to actually hyperlink. But you have all the information you need here to understand, where do these data come from? What are these data all about? What are the best practices for using them? Likewise, on the right-hand side, I've taken a screenshot of one of the sort of guidance documents that was published at the tail end of the pandemic into the last school year, thinking about how are we going to have good operational strategies for ensuring public health for children. And you can see the logos in the top left corner: State Department of Education, Office of Early Childhood, and Department of Public Health. all came together to say, how are we going to write down step-by-step instructions or provide resources to people who are going to have to take the strategies we know so closely ourselves because we are experts and put them into operation elsewhere. So this is a document providing resources, backup ideas, and links to other documentation. So it's like a guidance document. So in both of these cases, these are examples of documentation, a place where you actually put the ideas, put the information. If you stepped away from, you could bring yourself back to where you were. And I encourage folks to look around you already and see what kind of documentation and you already are using. One of the reasons why documentation is so important is that we think that we're going to remember things, but we're human, we're fallible, and also our lives get very busy. So often we're heads down on a project. Say, for instance, we're heads down on publishing the data set that it happens to appear over here on the left. And Augusta and I have been heads down on this for a few weeks now. It would be very easy once we publish the data set to forget the name of the public act. It would be very easy to forget exactly why we're doing this on a monthly basis. By writing it down, we actually have a place to come back to remind ourselves, oh, what was that Public Act number again? Or can I refer someone to the information about the data set? And this helps you help your user as well, help themselves. So on the right-hand panel, this guidance, there's probably many of these emails or links that probably been shared with individual schools, building leaders, districts many times, but they wanted to put everything in one place so they could share and help their user sort of remind themselves. So documentation are basically step-by-step instructions for making facts or making ideas. So I wanted to walk you through how sometimes the public can often think about how data and facts are made and show you how by documenting even the process, and this is a bit of a light example, but by documenting the process, you start to iron out, oh wow, there are really challenges over here in this step, or there's challenges over here in this step. Documentation helps you kind of lay things out. So I'm a tactile kind of I'm a tactile learner, I'm a tactile educator. So I like pictures because I think it helps us really, and actually picking icons for some of this is really challenging. But when we think about where our if we're creating documentation for facts or ideas that we made, we have to think about sort of where do they come from. So we often start in this place with the data that we have and we put it somewhere. Maybe all of these data that appear here go into your data collection system. Maybe it's a survey that you've administered. Um, Most of the time, people think that this next step is like something magical happens and then you have some facts. So if you aren't working with the data specifically, this might be your impression like, oh, we have data and then we have facts. But there's a lot of things that happen in the middle. And if I was coming to this process brand new, I would need to know a little bit more about what happens in the middle. So documentation helps you capture the what part, the what happens to the data part. So you can see in the middle, there's probably different ways of thinking. Now, I was thinking about number crunching when I was pulling this mallet image, but there are some things that happen to data in the process of going from raw information to more polished facts and insights. By way of example, when I was working at the Office of Early Childhood, there were a number of statistics that we cited around families and housing security. So, this a certain share of children living in families were actually experiencing homelessness at a given time. That would be an example of something on this voila facts end of things. But when I was asked when I joined the agency, well, where did that data come from? I backed up and tried to figure out, well, what data are we using and what process was adopted? And I was still new, so I didn't really have a way of going back to where the data came from or even the source of that fact, whether we made it, whether it came from another place. So documentation would have helped me, if there was documentation to refer to, it would have helped me know, oh, when we cite this housing statistic, it's actually created by the Department of Housing or by the Connecticut Coalition to End Housing. And so documentation is one way of sort of putting those facts down on paper so that we avoid this process of everyone thinking it's kind of a magical thing and we actually capture what happened in that analysis. But there are other parts of an analysis. So oftentimes the data come in and some analytical process happens. And then as we talked in our building a data culture and strengthening data literacy workshops, people are involved. People actually choose what information gets communicated. There's some kind of process of either, you know, sprucing it up, creating a story, or building it into some other kind of process before we get to this fact. stage. So it's not as simple as this. There's people involved after we do that analysis. And one could make the argument, if you were a part of the building a data culture conversation, that people are involved in lots of places. There's people that contribute to what data are created, what analysis happens. People are involved to make that data story that leads to the facts. And then we haven't really gotten into this in our conversation yet. People are an audience for those facts and they react and tell a different story about that data. So if I was to keep mapping this process, there's lots of places where people are involved or where analysis splits into different groups, or there's lots of different ways we could break this up into different pieces. Um, so after the storytelling, it's just important to note that, again, we're not as simple as, there we go. Um, it's not as simple as this 2-step or 3-step or 5-step. We get here, and at every stage, there's a chance to document something. So how we got all the way here, we may have had to make a choice all the way back here in our data collection that actually leads us to a specific set of facts. But maybe if we made a different choice with the people over here, maybe this would have splintered in a different direction. So it's important to just keep reminding oneself that there's a place to write things down. And anytime you think that you don't need to, or you'll remember it later, chances are it's good to send yourself a quick email or a Teams chat or something to remember, write it down somewhere. So, um, but this is a lot. So this already looks like chaos to me. And if folks have feedback or thoughts on this imagery, that would be really helpful. As I was putting it together, I was thinking to myself, um, yeah, this looks like a lot of steps. And if I was brand new to this process, I would be a little bit overwhelmed. And not to further overwhelm you, but this is just one process, most likely. So, thinking about DECD, the business that happens in your agency, there's so many different types of business, ways that you're using data and information, whether it's data you collect or data that comes from another source. And so there's lots of chances to document. So actually, there's lots of processes. This is the same process repeated 4 times over on one slide. It's so many things. So when thinking about how and where to start with documentation, my recommendation is to pick one process, pick one place to actually start creating documentation. So that means backing up to this kind of picture. Okay, so every year we create a fact sheet, and that fact sheet means that we work as a team to bring together certain data elements. We analyze them, we talk about what the analysis says. And so work with a process like this because this is a lot. I'm going to take a pause for a second, see if this is making sense, if folks have feedback or questions. This is actually one of my most favorite topics to talk about because when you're done making documentation, you have actually something concrete that you can refer back to and you're helping your colleagues. So I actually love talking about this because while it feels really wild right now, like this looks wild. I get that. I actually love it's kind of bananas, but in organizing and creating a starting point, you're helping yourself do your job better, you're helping your colleagues be more efficient, and you're improving the way that you use data and information because you're going to make discoveries, you're going to want to document them. Okay. So, after you pick your process, you're going to want to pick a spot to start. Here I've highlighted the data collection phase. So when you're creating documentation, you're going to want to document all of the different phases and all of the different challenges. But you want to pick a spot, especially a spot. Maybe maybe you're documenting a new process. You're a brand new American Rescue Plan funded project, and you're creating the documentation for the whole project. And you haven't collected any data. You haven't done any of this other stuff yet. So you're right here. This is a good place to start. Open up a Word document, call it documentation draft at the top, and just write down some of the things that you observe as you're doing that data collection process. It's not something you're going to sit and do every day, maybe once a week, once every other week, something happens and you're like, oh, I don't want to forget that for next time. I actually love the sticky notes program because I think it's even easier. You have it always open, it auto saves, and you can always just toggle over, write a note down, and it'll be there for when you're ready to write your documentation. But maybe you're starting here. Maybe you've already done all this and you're ready to start communicating some new findings. And so this is a good place to say, well, when we started to analyze the data and present it in a chart, here are some of the things that we discovered about the data. You have to remember when you're making your charts. Documentation is really, it's kind of like the very unsexy things. It's not very exciting at times, but if you write it down, it means that you're not going to have the same, you're not going to make the same mistake twice. So once you pick one place to start documentation, then you just have to hone in, focus on, sort of how are you going to do this? And so I want to walk through what a process document or some kind of documentation could look like, because this way folks won't feel sort of as overwhelmed, like, well, I don't really understand what you mean when you say documentation. So I've taken some screenshots here of a process document that we've written very recently about a process that what we undertook here in the Data and Policy Analytics Unit. So we were supporting our colleagues at OPM who do health and human services policy planning. They were supporting aging and disability services. And so we were working with them to help them basically figure out how were they going to allocate some of the funding that they received in their American Rescue Plan allocation. And this is a two-page, it's actually, I think, a three-page document. I've just screenshotted the 2 pages here. But there are a couple of headings that provide, like a roadmap for what you're looking at. So there's a background section, then there's a section called data aggregation. This is just kind of like how we manage the data. There's an appendix to this, 2-pager document where we provide a little bit more detail. And I think on the 3rd page, which I don't have screenshotted here, there's some more step-by-step instructions. So a process document is going to have a couple of really important elements. It's going to have a background section. Why are we doing this process at all? So if you, just to back up for a second, if you picked this spot right here, you're a brand new project and now you want to begin documenting. You may want to talk about what the project is. It might feel silly to write that down initially. You might think to yourself, well, I know what this project is because I'm the leader of the project. But if you were to walk away from the project, take vacation for 2 weeks, suffer an unexpected illness where you were out for an extended period of time, win the lottery, and decide to leave state service, it would be helpful for somebody to know why the process existed. When I was at the Office of Early Childhood, we had a new reporting process as part of our American Rescue Plan funding. And so the background section talked a little bit about both the report that we were putting together, the new reporting process, and the new data system that were being used. I'm working on getting a copy of that documentation to share because it's pretty extensive, but I think it would be a really great example. So you'd start with the background, and you can see underneath of the background that in here we just talked a little bit about how senior centers were going to be receiving money from Health and Human Services, how Aging and Disability Services contacted our colleagues at OPM, who then contacted us, so that it was just clear as to how the communication happened the way that it did and why we were included. Then we talk a little bit about some of the criteria that we use. So if anyone ever asks, well, why did you choose these variables or why did you choose this data? We actually have we have rationale that we vetted with our aging and disability services colleagues as well. So there's a background section to give people kind of a sense of the context. Then there's some information and details about the actual data that you're using. In this case, we weren't collecting new data, we were actually using data that already existed collected by the census. So we wanted to make sure that we were clear about the data that we use, the place that it came from, the timing of the data. And so we listed here census indicators that we wanted to use. This is actually kind of even a high level explanation. So that's why we wanted to include an appendix. And in the appendix, we actually get into nitty gritty details about the tables where things came from, the variables. And if you're a frequent census user, you know that having some of these details are really helpful. It eliminates a lot of guesswork. You know exactly where to go if you wanted to replicate what was happening here. And then we include all of the data management here. So using a specific data management package in a statistical software tool. Here's what we did with the following data. And down below, we made some calculations and we included the data here. And then at the very bottom, there's this teeny tiny text that says we link somewhere else. So this is also a document that could be hyperlinked. So in a lot of ways, what we've done is we've left ourselves in a very, very short document, breadcrumbs back to the original question of how are we going to actually distribute these funds? You can see that writing a document like this, it's not like writing a novel, it's not like writing an op-ed, it's not creative necessarily, but it's very, very useful. It helps make work more efficient, and it documents all the steps and decisions that were made, why they were made, If there was rationale needed for some of those decisions, you could even link in email conversations, or you could include those in an appendix so that you just have all of the rationale for the process. Once you start building this documentation, you're adding to the data culture of your agency. In our building a data culture conversation, we talked a little bit about how becoming a data person, you build your data culture. By building documentation, you're also building up a repository, a record of where information came from and how you as an agency or an organization or a project leader go about doing things. And it leaves people in the organization saying to themselves, why don't we have this for everything? So one question people ask is, where do you start? And this is the same question that I posed in building a data culture. A lot of the same questions apply to all instances. And our answer is start where you are. So you want to start writing things down. And this is sort of when we encouraged you to pick a part of pick one process. Now you just want to write things down. Don't worry so much about the sort of the format, or just start getting down on paper a lot of the elements of what a final process document or frequently asked questions or checklist could look like. So those include things like who's responsible. And when we say who's responsible, that could be for the data, for the administration, for the communication. uh, if there's deadlines or timelines. So, we in the Office of Policy Management, we work with agencies who are reporting on a quarterly basis. So that means we know that when the quarter end happens, the month after that is the reporting month. So we know when we can sort of plan on our busy times, when we know agencies will be focused on reporting as opposed to regular data collection or analysis or storytelling. Something really important is to think about file locations. Where are you going to put this so that people have access to it? What are the steps in the process that you're undertaking? And maybe you don't write those steps down in order initially. Maybe you just write down ideas because maybe initially you undertook steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 in a different order. You did step 2 first and you didn't realize you should have done step 1 first. And you learned that along the way. That's what goes in a process document. Great thing to include in a process document are definitions. If you establish a definition, or if you're using a definition from somewhere, you want to make sure that your reader, your colleagues know where those definitions came from. That's a super, super important and sort of integral element to documentation. And then this is a place where you can just include notes for later. So you can write down for the future, for future improvements, the next time we do something. um, I wanted to talk through this documentation conversation first in a very basic way. In the future, I'll loop in some other examples that I've created where it's really soup to nuts. It's maybe a very long documentation document, several pages or even up to 10 pages, because as the process changed or we worked through it, we just made new discoveries and added new things to it. So don't worry about the format don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Just write things down. And so just some considerations when you're writing things down. You want to make sure that you pick a place where many people can access the document. So I would encourage you to use cloud sharing, team sites to encourage collaboration so people can be working on the same document at the same time. I would also encourage you to label the document draft. There's something psychological about making sure people understand that this is a work in progress. You might get to a point where you say, this is like, we're done here. This is the final version for now, and you call it version 1. And maybe you make some improvements over the next 2 quarters, and maybe there's a version 1.1 or version 2. But in the beginning, I think people feel less worry when they actually are able to write freely without any worry of criticism or critique. Getting things written down is probably the biggest, hardest step to starting documentation, because writing these things down, you start to write them and you're like, wow, this is really tedious. First, this happened, then this happened, then I did these 5 things in a bulleted list. It starts to feel a little bit, it takes more time than you think. So you could start by writing an outline. You could start by writing steps as you go. It could just be a big jumbled document and everybody works together to actually edit it together at some point. But make sure you pick a place where everyone can access the document together at the same time. So the second action step that I encourage is to, after you pick a process to focus on, write everything down. As much stuff as you can write down. You could even make it a part of your a weekly meeting or make a time where everyone just writes together in the same document. You could have it on your screen. Facilitated documentation writing sessions would be a really great way to work together. So if it's something that you want support from evaluation and impact on, let us know. Any thoughts or feedback on those suggestions and ideas as I take a sip of coffee? I joke in some workshops that I have two. I have a teenager and a tweenager, so sometimes the silence does not worry me. So once you actually start your documentation, you write things down, you're going to get to a point where you need to work with others to make sure others can read and understand that documentation. So this is, like I said, an ongoing process. There's continuous quality improvement happening, both in the using of the data and in the writing of the documentation. So you may want to start even before you start making documentation with a planning discussion. Is there anything already written down? The worst thing would be to duplicate efforts. So you want to make sure that if things are written down, that the team is aware of them. Maybe there's multiple places where information about the process already exists. That planning discussion is a place where you can actually talk about where you will save the documentation. So maybe it's on your group's team site at the very tippy top where you pin the file. Maybe it's on a shared drive that you all access routinely. I would discourage folks from saving documentation or planning to save documentation in a chat or in a meeting chat, like a chat associated with a calendar invitation, as those things tend to get lost or confused. And the last thing you want to do is use cloud-based tools where people are working in two different places at once. It just leads to frustration. So in making the documentation, you want to make sure that you plan a little in the beginning. You want to write things down and get moving, but make sure you kind of have a little discussion about where things are going to be. Then there's ongoing review. So once you actually get moving on the documentation, it's a living, breathing document that people will be using. So maybe what you're documenting are the processes for how you do the reporting every quarter for the American Rescue Plan Treasury reports. If that documentation, if you've made internal documentation about who's responsible, what steps you take, who you contact if you have problems, you're going to be looking at it once every 3 months. So you want to make sure that after you use it, if there's any improvements or changes that need to be made, that you actually talk through with your team, talk through with the folks who are going to be using that documentation. So I'd encourage folks to establish a regular agenda item in team meetings or in team discussions so that you don't just leave that documentation to sit out in the rain where it could get ruined, it um, could get confused or bent or crumpled up. You want to make sure that the documentation stays fresh and that sort of requires fresh eyes on it periodically. And then every time you use the documentation, so maybe it's a monthly process that you do or a weekly process. Every time you use it, consider a really quick discussion. Maybe it's a commenting in the document, or maybe it's a Teams chat that you have asynchronously, or maybe it is an actual, face-to-face or virtual conversation where you talk about, oh, I didn't really understand step two, or in the background section, it said we referenced this public act, but actually it really comes from this other place, this other sort of agency process. In having an ongoing review and an ongoing discussion, you're actually going to be improving the quality of the document. So you're not going to be um, stuck with the same thing that maybe somebody knows, oh, step three is really confusing, but don't worry, the person who knows it or uses the document actively knows what to do. The whole goal is to have a document that anyone can use, that anyone can pick up and follow, because there are lots of ways that the work can be shared, shifted, changing, and we want to make sure that there's a place where it gets recorded. So the third action step, and this can take a few different forms, is just to focus on continuously improving the documentation. So it's never really a fully set in stone process. There's always ways to take the documentation and make it better, easier to understand, more efficient, more available. Um, and once at some point, it will no longer be a draft. It'll actually be like the version that you're using all the time. But every time you improve upon it, you may want to save a new version so that you can archive those older versions. So there aren't, you don't lose track of the knowledge that you've built. At the same time, you have the most up-to-date information. We have a couple of examples. I can share some of those this morning if folks are interested in seeing them. I'm going to continue adding to this list as the month goes on. So we had a couple of things that we're using, handbooks, style guides. Those are great examples of documentation because they provide step-by-step instructions or ideas about how to actually capture some of this information. In summary around documentation, we're encouraging folks to pick a process to document. It doesn't have to be every single thing your agency does. Just pick one place to begin. Especially if there's help needed with the American Rescue Plan Act funded projects, that's what we're here for. Then we're encouraging you to write things down. Write them down in a draft form. Write them down in a sticky note on your desktop. Just start writing things down about the work that you're doing. And then find ways to make continuous improvements to the documentation. So eventually you'll bring all of those sticky notes together into one document. All of your colleagues will be aware, or your leadership will be aware such a document exists. And then periodically make improvements to that document so that you can keep the process very fresh. I'm going to pause for a moment and see if folks have thoughts, feedback, questions. This actually doesn't have to just apply to the work as well. I can just provide an outside of work example. I'm currently sort of consulting for a nonprofit organization, and they are using different sources of data to understand fundraising. So in a memo I recently wrote to them, which I consider a form of documentation, I had pulled together all of the information that I had gathered about their different data sources. They might know some of the information I've written down, but I had to ask different people who don't necessarily work together questions to get my sort of really understand their data. So in the memo that I wrote, I basically listed off all of the things that I understood about the data for them to sanity check. I expected the readers to reply to me at some point and say, actually, you've written this thing down here, but that's not really how it goes in practice. And that's an opportunity for me to improve that document. And in the memo, the very end, I actually offer up some insights and facts that I generated from the data, which is what they really wanted to know. But if I had to return to the data, I can't guarantee I would have remembered every single little thing that I had learned about the data. And it all lived in emails and text chains and notes I'd written down to myself. So the memo gave me an opportunity to put everything in one place. If I can find a way to share that memo by redacting the information, the organization's information, I'll do that in a future workshop. Because I think it'll be a good example to see something that's not necessarily um, work related, but still kind of does the same action. So this is one of a number of workshops that we're hoping to offer over the next few months. I've shown this list to most folks who have attended last month's workshops. We're really working, I think, next month towards data visualizations and data storytelling. We're working on building a series around survey and form design. We have an expert out of the UConn School of Public Policy who is available, and we're working with her to figure out the best format for that, whether it'll be one shot or a series. So today is March 7th, and it's our first documentation meeting, but we're going to run this again in 2 weeks. It may look a little different in 2 weeks because I think I'll have some different examples pulled in as well. I wasn't able to gather as many as I would have liked for today's conversation. So every conversation is similar, but not exactly the same. So you're welcome to come back in 2 weeks. And then in the off weeks, what we'll be doing is talking about data collection specifically. That came up in a lot of people's feedback surveys around things that they needed support around. And it's kind of a really general topic. It's kind of a big topic, data collection broadly read. But I think what we'll be doing is going back to some of the initial questions we talked through in building a data culture, where we talked through some of how to meet your mission, how you're measuring what you do, measuring the impact that you have. So we're going to be talking through some really foundational kinds of data collection questions in the other two sessions. And then every day that we meet afterwards, I reserve an hour if folks have specific questions about their work, and it doesn't have to be related to the American Rescue Plan, so you should feel free to avail yourselves of those times. And this is our contact information, both my contact information and Augusta's as well, but you really have the whole data and policy analytics team at your disposal. So you should consider us colleagues in the work and interested partners. So I'm actually going to stop sharing for a moment so I can take a second to grab our evaluation form and put a link in the in the chat thread here. But if folks have questions, we're a small group today, so you should feel free to unmute and ask away, or don't because you feel like it was helpful or not helpful and is what you needed or not what you needed. All these things are welcome. But we really hope that you'll consider providing us some feedback. We've made this in a Google form so that it's truly, truly anonymous. And your feedback helps us pick topics, shape how we do this work. And actually, now that I'm talking through it, I realize that in the form there isn't an option for building a data culture documentation because that's new as of today. So now that will be there. And we are here for you. So thanks for coming today to both of you. And if you have feedback, questions, ideas, now's your moment.
No, thank you so much. I'll fill out the evaluation form. Thank you.
Thanks, Kara. And please tell colleagues, tell your friends. And across state government, we're excited to be supporting folks in any way we can.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Kara.
Appreciate it.
No worries. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.